If you didn't sign in, please do that before you leave. This program is sponsored through a grant from the North Carolina Arts Council, and I have to account for numbers with the report I do in June. So if y'all will please sign in. I don't give names, I just report numbers. But I appreciate y'all coming, and we're so glad to have Bob back with us. So he's a North Carolina native that could trace his roots back to the mid-17th century when his ancestors and their dogs arrived here from Germany. By 1763, his great-great-great-grandfather, George, had married and settled in the Piedmont foothills of North Carolina, where he and his wife raised a large family. One of their sons, Henry, Bob's great-great-uncle, took some of the family dogs with him to what's now Haywood County in about 1805. He and his brother-in-law, Jonathan Osborne, followed the old Rutherford trace through what is now downtown Canton and planted a corn crop in a riverbed near Dutch Cove. You all know where Dutch Cove is? Crop failed. He endured a hard mountain winter with his dogs before following the Rutherford trace over Pigeon Gap in the early spring, went on to what is now Waynesville and Hazelwood to claim land there. That area became known as Plott Valley, and the creek that runs through the property became known as Plott Creek, and the towering mountain range above the home became known as the Plott Balsams. So does it still retain those names?
It does.
The Plott Hound breed eventually gained worldwide notoriety as the premier big game hunting dog in the world as subsequent generations continued to raise the dogs. Became the official state dog in the late 1990s, and rightfully so, as the legacy of the Plott clan and their storied hounds extends across our entire state, not just Haywood County and our mountains. So Bob is an accomplished wood carver, has conducted programs across the state, runs the Plott Festival.
Plott Fest, yep.
That's coming up in May, so
16th.
he'll tell you all about that. He has several books that he's written under his belt, and his newest one is
Appalachian Folkways, Perpetuating Crafts and Family Legacies. I'm sold out of it right now. It's sold really well.
Yeah, and I think mine's at home, so I'd show you what it is. It's got great stories in it about people across the state, and you just need to get it and read it. You will learn a lot about people you thought you knew. So I will turn it over to you. This is your time to shine, and he's going to tell us about the Regulators and the Rutherford trace.
Thank you,
And then we
Cindy.
have a test afterward.
That's right.
No, I'm kidding.
Pay attention.
I'm kidding.
No, thank you so much, Cindy. It's always a pleasure to be back here. Feels like coming home. I've been here so many times, and Cindy and her staff have become friends. And a lot of folks here I recognize from past programs and appreciate you coming, especially on a cold morning like this morning. But as Cindy told you, I've been very, very fortunate to write 7 books, working on the 8th one now. We do programs all over the state, all over the Southeast. Been very fortunate to have won some awards, ordered the Longleaf Pine Award back in 2016, some things like that. And we do a festival in Maggie Valley, North Carolina called Plott Fest every year. We've been doing that since 2012. And basically that's a festival that celebrates the Plott Hound, which is the official state dog of North Carolina. It became the official state dog in about 1989. We did a program on that here earlier this year, and I really enjoyed doing that. I still raise the dogs today. Somebody in my family's raised them for over 200 years in North Carolina. But Plott Fest celebrates the Plott Hound, also Southern Mountain culture. We have music, we have programs. One of the guys featured in my newest book, William Ritter, who's a great storyteller, singer, and songwriter, he'll be performing there that day. We have crafts. There'll probably be 250 dogs there doing all sorts of dog events, UKC bench show, mechanical bear bays, just all sorts of fun things. And we got about 25 to 30 crafters. They're demonstrating their wares, selling their wares. We've got 6 food trucks selling some really good food, and we'll be doing a program on stage it's just a real fun day. And so we try to make it really inclusive. A lot of events of this type are kind of, the people kind of tend to but just only want hunters there. And I'm all for hunting. I hunt myself, but I want everybody there. If you just like dogs, or if you just like history, or if you just want to come and hear some good music, or see some good crafts, or eat some good food, we want you there. So we got one rule there: be nice or leave, and that's it. So it's pretty easy to get into and pretty much fun. It'll be May 16th. You can go to my website. I got a card there. You look on the card, bobplott.net. There'll be a full schedule of those events, starting at 8 o'clock that morning, running until 6:30 that night. So please come if you can. Now, I do a lot of programs, a lot around the Plott Hound. Most of the books that I've written have kind of pertained to that in one way or another. But I've also been really interested in Revolutionary War, French and Indian War stuff as well, and have done a lot of programs on that, as well as primitive survival skills. Taught some classes on that, and as Cindy mentioned, I like to do wood carving, do a lot of that too. In 2022, I nearly died of COVID and pneumonia. I was in the hospital for over a month, was in intensive care for over 2 weeks, and it was really, really brutal time, and had to go through physical therapy to learn how to walk again. And the reason I tell you that's not to get any sort of sympathy, because I'm fine now for the most part, but one thing it did do was it really affected my memory. I used to be really great about meeting somebody one time and I knew exactly who they were if I saw them 10 years later. Now I see the face and I'm going, I know that person, but I sure don't remember their name. You know, I get really embarrassed at times, and you know, I'm not getting any younger, so that might have something to do with it too. But that's, so, you know, that's been kind of a challenge. And also, most all these programs I had done for so long that I could just do from memory. Now, the Plott Dog program I still can, because I've done it my whole life, pretty much. But this one, because it has so many dates and so many moving parts, I kind of refer to notes just for that, so bear with me and for that reason, because I want to make sure I get it right, and I want to make sure that I get everything, you know, in this small window we have to tell this story that's pretty in-depth. But you know, I love a good story. I love storytelling. I love you know, hearing these things and telling these things. And this particular era, I do another program on the Griffin and Grant expedition, which I talk about in my 4th book, that took place during the French and Indian War, and it kind of is a prelude to this. But that era in the South, between late 1750s up until right after the Revolutionary War, is one of my favorite time periods. And it's a time that not many people know about. And so that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. One of the things that I feel like people have neglected for whatever reason, maybe it's just prejudice toward the South, I don't know, but they don't talk about the importance of the Revolutionary War in the South and how the seeds of the war were really started in the South even before the Declaration of Independence. When you see, you know, Ken Burns' documentary or any other sort of documentary about or book about the Revolutionary War, it seems to be mostly centered on the New England area, Boston, Philadelphia, that type of thing. But what a lot of people fail to realize, and you know, I really enjoyed the Burns documentary, don't get me wrong, and I admire his work, and I especially enjoyed how the first part of the documentary, he put a lot of time into the impact it had on Indian nations, and we'll talk a little bit about that today too. But I really thought, because of the importance of Kings Mountain, Cowpens, and Guilford Courthouse, which were really the turning battles of the war, that he would have put more time into that, but he didn't. And so I was really disappointed in that. And I do a whole program on that, did that earlier this year, and I really enjoy that. As a matter of fact, before we get into this, Cindy will appreciate this. I'm always trying to learn new things, even when I've done past programs. And y'all may have already know this if you know anything about Kings Mountain, but I didn't. I found out that there were 5 black men at Kings Mountain. 4 of them were freedmen. I'll tell you their names shortly when I get to that part of the program, but one of them was probably a slave of William Campbell, who was the overall leader of the group. And he was freed in 1793. His name was John Broddy, B-R-O-D-D-Y. I guess they pronounce it that way. So it's always interesting to me to find those type of things. But what we're going to talk about today is, you know, we'll do a program another time. Hopefully we'll come back and do the Kings Mountain if you hadn't seen that before. But today we're going to talk mainly on the Regulator Rebellion, which a lot of people don't know about, and the 1776 Griffin-Rutherford expedition, the Griffin, or the Rutherford campaigns it's sometimes called. Now, a lot of people don't understand that the war seeds of discontent were being sown as early as 1760s. People in the frontier people or anywhere west of the coastal plain were kind of seen as second-class citizens. The English taxed them heavily. They used them as a kind of a buffer between the Indian country because they didn't want to have to fight the Indians themselves. And another thing that people don't realize back in those days is, particularly in South Carolina, the black population was far larger than the white population. So the biggest fear that these white plantation owners had was that freed black men, and there were quite a few of them, and slaves would join together and join the Cherokee and run them off. And they could have. If they'd ever gotten somebody to pull that group together, they very easily could have. And we talk a lot about that in another program. But so all this kind of created discontent. And when the French and Indian War started with the Grant and Griffin campaigns, Griffin campaigns, I'm sorry, that was another mess because they had American militiamen in, and you look at the journals from that, they just talked terrible things about the Americans. They had no respect for them, called them white trash, insulted their women. I mean, they just thought they were just a lower breed of people. So these frontiersmen didn't appreciate that, and who would? And they didn't appreciate being the buffer. They had been given land by the Crown to settle on, but they were taxed heavily for it. And like I said, they were a buffer because they wouldn't send help for them to fight the Indians. So it was really a kind of a touchy situation as early as before the French and Indian War. And of course, they were expected to fight in the French and Indian War. And you have to understand too that that North and South Carolina were primary sources of income for Britain, in that in the South Carolina in particular, you had the rice fields, indigo, tobacco in North Carolina and South Carolina, but the fur trade was huge. And a lot of people don't know much about that or have forgotten about that. Everybody's heard about fur trade, but not to this extent, I don't think. The fur trade began in the early 1700s and was so lucrative by 1716 that the English king appointed a superintendent to oversee it. And it was becoming a problem somewhat to the Cherokee, or not just Cherokee, but all the Indian tribes as well, because they were starting to lose sight of what they had done their whole lives. They had hunted with bow and arrows, with spears. They made their own arrowheads. They created their tools, pottery, whatever. All of a sudden, they could get guns. They could get gunpowder. They could get knives, tomahawks, metal, woven material that they could make dresses and clothes and shirts out of. And so this was, big. I mean, you can imagine if you were kind of a indigenous people, wearing buckskin clothing, making buckskin moccasins, all of a sudden you could buy this type of stuff or trade for this sort of thing. It was a pretty big deal. And they were also coveting things that other things they couldn't get, such as sugar and jewelry, and unfortunately alcohol. One of the things we found out in later years was that Indians or indigenous people didn't have a real high tolerance for alcohol for whatever reason. And so a lot of times crooked traders would, get them drunk and then rip them off for their furs or get them for a lot less price. But it had gotten so bad that a standard value system was implemented by the government. So to give you an idea of just how valuable these deer hides, it's mostly deer hides. Strangely enough, they didn't care too much about, there was buffalo, plenty of buffalo, huge buffalo hides. I've tanned a buffalo hide and have one, and I can tell you it's not something you want to do but one time. It's brutal work. And I can see now why the Indians made their women do it, because, I sure wouldn't want to do it all the time, but then I feel sorry for their women for having to do it. But anyway, they wasn't a lot of money in buffalo hides, bear hides, that type of things, although there were plenty of them. Deer hides were the main trade. So a rifle or a smoothbore musket was worth 35 dressed deer hides. 1 yard of woven cloth brought 8 deer hides. You could get an axe or a hatchet for 5 hides, and you could get 30 bullets or molded lead musket balls that were worth 1 deer hide. Now, this is something you've heard the term, everybody calls $1 a buck, right? Well, that's where this came from. 1 deer hide was essentially worth $1. So they started calling, that kind of became the term for $1, a buck. That's where that term originated. And a buck, of course, being a large male deer. So, and it produced a bigger hide, which made it a little bit more valuable. Items like salt were extremely valuable. Cook kettles, mirrors, little, things like mirrors, for example, and jewelry were greatly overcharged and were just really cheap, flashy items that were worth far, far less than any of those hides. But some of the traders were very, very honest and ethical. A lot of them weren't, and this really started causing some bad feelings among the tribal members. And of course, it hurt in other areas too, because the native people basically hurt them in 3 major categories. One, in killing all these deer, they had begun to kill off their own major food source and didn't have anything to replace it with much. And they were killing for money. Secondly, the interaction with Europeans caused them to contract a lot of diseases that weren't native to their land. Smallpox, different things like that. And also alcohol, as I mentioned before. The low tolerance for alcohol was a cause for alcoholism. And the tribes were becoming so dependent on it that in 1745, a Cherokee chief by the name of Skagunsta wrote a letter to the governor of South Carolina. And he was lamenting the dependence of the tribes, or the tribe's dependence on trade goods. And he wrote, "Our people can no longer live independently from the English. We no longer can make our own weapons, our own ammunition, or clothes. Every necessity of life comes from the white man." And so he knew this was a problem. And he was, 1745, he was a visionary because a lot of people could care less at that time. But to better illustrate how huge this business was, let's look at these numbers for a second. In the year 1748, British exported 160,000 deer skins worth $1.25 million to England out of Charleston, or Charlestown as it was called then. In 1751, only 2,000 Cherokee hunters produced over 100,000 pounds of deer hides for trade. The superintendent projected in 1755 that there would be 3,500 deer hides for one trading district alone, and there were multiple trading districts. And so that would have placed the total value of the Cherokee trade in just that 1 year of over 250,000 skins. Now, assuming this was the number or the norm between 1739 and 1761, it's safe to say that the Cherokee alone slaughtered over 500,000 deer in those years alone. And quite honestly, that number is really low, I think. I think if you go back and look at a more detailed examination of those records, and I have, they probably killed at least 1 million deer during this period, and more likely in that almost 20-year period, or was 20-year period, closer to 5 million. So, I mean, they were decimating the deer population. Now, to be fair, there were deer being traded by white men too. There were white hunters doing this, and the guys on the frontier were doing it. So they were doing it a lot too. But there weren't as many of them, and they were in the minority. You also have to understand that the British had prohibited the Americans from hunting in Cherokee territory. So if they went and hunted in those territories, they could be arrested for that. So that was another source of problems between the Crown and the Americans. So basically, it was illegal in upcountry South Carolina or in Western North Carolina for anybody to go hunt. And this didn't sit well with these frontiersmen. In fact, they had set up forts at Fort Loudon in Tennessee, Fort 96 in South Carolina, Fort Dobbs down near Statesville, and Fort Chiswell up near Wytheville, Virginia, present-day Wytheville, Virginia, to kind of regulate white people from coming in those areas. Now, you might be asking yourself, what's all this got to do with the Revolutionary War and causing seeds of discontent for the rebellion? And the answer is simple. The frontiersmen felt like they were being used as buffers. They were being paid, forced to pay huge amounts of taxes. They were treated like second-class citizens, and they weren't allowed to hunt anywhere they wanted to. And so they came to America for freedom, and they weren't getting it. So that was causing a problem. Now, many of these were former indentured servants, and they had been given a new chance in the colony. And others were among the hundreds of thousands of British, Welsh, Irish, Scotch, German, like my folks were, who had moved to America to escape religious persecution. But all of them, they weren't encouraged to live near Charleston or down on New Bern in that area. They were encouraged to go west. They didn't want the frontier trash or the white trash, near the rich people, so to speak. So they were given significant land grants, which was a good thing, and that seemed like a good thing, and it was, because the land was free and they could worship and build their own churches. But these taxes were just also stifling, and they were also forced to serve in the militia. And again, as I said, they were disrespected. So a lot of the frontiersmen just started ignoring the law and started hunting in Cherokee areas, and this caused problems between the Cherokee and the frontiersmen, started resulting in some raids on the frontier. And then, of course, it caused problems between the British and the Cherokee and the British and the American frontiersmen. So, and this wasn't any different in the coastal plain of North Carolina either, down around the Burlington area. And this is where the Regulators were forming in the 1760s. Now, the Regulators' name is a name given to American patriots by the English. It was a derogatory term in England. And they were so named because of their desire, the Regulators' desire, to regulate their own affairs, to basically say, we want to live our own lives. We don't want you to tell us what we're going to do. So they wanted to see fair laws established. They wanted to end the corruption and unfair taxes. And so they wore the Regulator name with pride. The Regulator Rebellion, which is really the first Revolutionary War, if you think about it, started in 1766, and it went till 1771. Now, the North Carolina backcountry folks, the Regulators, had taken up arms against the British, and they were basically demanding honest government, less taxes, and no discrimination. They wanted the same rights as the low country plantation owners. It was that simple. So this conflict raged on for 5 years, with skirmishes going on almost daily, weekly. Nobody was really winning. It was just kind of back and forth. But it kind of culminated in the Battle of Alamance on May 16th, 1771, near the present-day city of Burlington, North Carolina. The British sent provincial militia led by Griffin Rutherford, Francis Nash, and Richard Caswell to quell this rebellion. And they soundly defeated the rebels, and worse yet, later hung 6 of them. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Now, ironically, both Nash and Rutherford would later play prominent roles as American revolutionary leaders. Caswell would become a member of the First Continental Congress and help draft the U.S. Constitution, and they both later regretted serving these roles for the British. But at this point, it might be a good idea to take a closer look at Rutherford himself, Griffin Rutherford, because we're going to talk about his turn to America and his 1776 campaign in a second. It seems hard to believe how this man could kill and hang his own neighbors in the defense of the British crown, and yet only a few years later fight those same British as a distinguished leader for the American cause during the Revolution. Griffin Rutherford was born in Ireland in 1721. His parents moved to the United States when he was a small child, but they died at sea, and he was raised by relatives in Pennsylvania. like most people that time period, he grew up hard. He was described, most men of that time period weren't very big. He was described as being about 5'8", with a very muscular frame and a head full of fiery red hair. He was very intelligent, but he didn't have much formal education, yet he became a very, very well-known surveyor, and a surveyor was probably one of the most important jobs you could have on the American frontier. And some guys took advantage of that and, kind of fudged the lines a lot for their own benefit sometimes too, and Rutherford was one of these guys, unfortunately. But Rutherford moved to Halifax County, North Carolina in 1750. He later then moved to what is now Rowan County in 1753, and he served as a captain under Colonel Hugh Waddell, who had a ranger battalion that was based at Fort Dobbs. And they were one of the original rangers of that time period, kind of like Rogers Rangers, and they dressed and fought like Indians, and they were feared by their Cherokee counterparts. Rutherford also fought at the Fort Duquesne, and he saw a lot of heavy combat during the war. Later, he claimed a 656-acre parcel of land that became known simply as the Irish settlement in Rowan County. And his skills as a surveyor made him very valuable to the rich people. They were not beyond falsifying claims, and they would pay him to do it, and if he surveyed incorrectly, and so he did. So between his huge farm, which was manned by a lot of slaves, his illegal dealings, Rutherford became very wealthy quickly. By 1765, he was one of the wealthiest men in the state. He further increased his income by becoming a prominent member of a group of crooked politicians who were known simply as the courthouse ring. They used the law, changed the law, adjusted the law to their own financial gain, often at the expense of the common man. And so Rutherford was not well thought of by these common folks, the farmers who were living in that area. As I mentioned, by 1766, they'd had enough and they rebelled, and of course that became known as the full-scale Regulator Rebellion. Now keep in mind, this was a full decade before the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War officially started in 1776, so this was 1766, 10 years before that. And again, just as with the Revolutionary War, these main issues were less taxes, less corrupt politicians, freedom to live your life as you wished without government intervention. And they called themselves regulators because, again, they wanted to regulate the own law. William Tryon, Colonel Hugh Waddell, and Griffin Rutherford, were the major leaders of the British who were fighting the Regulators. And they immediately started heavy campaigns against the Americans. Most of them, though, were small skirmishes initially. The two major leaders of the Americans, they're all Americans. That's the other thing, too, Cindy and I have talked a lot about. The Revolutionary War, a lot of people have lost sight of the fact this was America's first civil war. You hear about, the Civil War for free slavery and all that in 1863, but this was a civil war much earlier, because here they were really brothers fighting against brothers. These were all Americans. Rutherford and these guys were Americans. They were fighting Regulators. Battle of Kings Mountain, there were only 2 British officers at Kings Mountain, 2. Everybody else was Americans. So you had American Tories fighting American patriots. So these were guys that were neighbors, and there was a lot of resentment over this for years afterwards and during this. And so it was the same situation here. But the rebellion culminated, or basically ended, at the Battle of Alamance, which again took place on May 16, 1771, at Big Alamance Creek. The battle was about 2 hours long. There were 2,000 Regulators versus about 1,200 British. Now you'd think that would make it a lot heavily in the Americans' favor, but they were much more poorly armed than the British were. The British had cannon, they had a lot more guns, and so the British only lost 26 men, had 61 wounded. The Regulators lost over 100 men killed and had 200 wounded. And then 12 Americans were captured, in order to be hanged. 6 of them were pardoned, but 6 of them were hung. So this, between all this, now this just added insult to injury. The people really, really hated the British. Now, even though they had lost the war, so to speak, it was bad. And a lot of these regulators knew that if they stayed around, they would probably get hung too, or they'd be faced with more type of oppression. So they moved further west into this area, around Iredell County, Burke County, Wilkes County, that sort of thing. Now, at the same time this is going on, this is fueling the flame. So for the next 10 years or not 10 years, but next 5 years, between 1771 and 1776, tensions are just escalating, ramping up big time. And the land barons, again, rich people, were buying Cherokee land illegally. They were meeting with not Cherokee chiefs, they were meeting with Shawnee chiefs who were selling them Cherokee land. So, and getting, wagon loads of gunpowder, guns, and everything else for it. In March 1775 at Sycamore Shoals, Tennessee, Dragon Canoe was there, and Daniel Boone was an agent for Richard Henderson, who was the big rich guy. And Dragon Canoe was a Cherokee, and he'd gotten wind of this thing, and he went and told those guys. He said, "This is wrong. You are, the Shawnee are selling our land, and I'm going to tell you right now, this will prove to be a dark and bloody ground." And he was right. It was. Now that same year in 1775, the Mecklenburg Resolves were written by a group of patriots near present-day Charlotte, North Carolina. Now a lot of people don't know about this either. Now you may have heard about the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. There's a lot of controversy about that. Some people say that it was real and factual. Other people say not. I tend to be in the group that say not. We won't go into that in real detail, but the 1775 Mecklenburg Resolves are 100% factual. Well documented, proven, basically the Declaration of Independence before there was a Declaration of Independence, and that took place right here in North Carolina. The Mecklenburg Resolves were written by Thomas Polk and Ephraim Brevard, and they were 2 American patriots living in Mecklenburg County at that time. And their document declared that all British rule and laws were null and void. They demanded an end to taxes. They demanded self-rule, and they outlined a selection process for officials and a meeting schedule for these officials that was really the prelude to our Constitution. So these guys had laid the groundwork for the United States Constitution that would take place more than 10 years later. Now, not only is this well documented, these resolves were published in full in the North Carolina Gazette on June 16th, 1775, so you can look that up and read it. And again, this was more than a year before the famous Declaration of Independence was written. So I find it really interesting that you don't know about that. Most people don't. Nobody talks about that. Nobody mentions it, but it's true. But let's go back to Rutherford. By 1776, Griffin Rutherford had had a radical change of heart. He became a colonel in the local militia near Salisbury, North Carolina, when the Revolutionary War began in 1776. He soon was promoted to brigadier general of the Salisbury District militia, and he was really concerned at the big increase in raids that were taking place by the Indians on the frontier. And keep in mind, when we're talking about the frontier, we're talking about really where we are now. Where Statesville, North Carolina is now, was about the borderline. From there west was just frontier, wild, wild, wild country. And so the war had started in 1776. The regular army had their efforts focused on the north. The British, the American militia, or army, if you want to call it that, in North Carolina was pretty much a ragtag bunch of frontiersmen. But the South was really, the concern wasn't so much the British as it was the Shawnee and the Cherokee. They were lucky to have Catawba Indians as their allies, and some others as well. But basically here in North Carolina and upstate South Carolina, the concern was not so much the British as much as it was the Indians. And of course the British were fueling the Indians. They were giving them weapons. They were allies with the natives. So in 1776, there were 36,000 Cherokees living in about a 140,000 square mile region they included what's now Western North Carolina, upstate South Carolina, East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, North Georgia, and North Alabama. Now, they were a formidable force. And I talk a little bit about this in my fourth book. They were led by fierce warriors such as the Ostenaco and Oconostota and Dragon Canoe. And those are three names that should be more prevalent in American history as well, because these three warriors, chiefs, done things that no other Indian had ever done before and very few ever did after. For example, no Indian tribe to that point had ever, or really since, had defeated a major British Army campaign led by General Grant in 1760, a complete massacre pretty much, at Cowley Pass. They also captured a British fort, Fort Loudon in Tennessee, and this was both done entirely with Cherokee forces. They didn't have French allies, they didn't have nobody else helping them. Because at that time, they just wanted the British out here. As the Revolutionary War begun, they started allying with the British because it benefited them. But other forts in battle, such as Fort Necessity and Braddock's Defeat, there had been Indians there too, but they'd always been supported by the French. These victories were secured and led and fought entirely by Cherokee. So these guys were special. They had signed a treaty after the Griffin expedition in 1760, 1761 actually. They signed a treaty basically saying they wouldn't fight the British anymore. So I'm backing up a little bit again here. But they had given most of their land in South Carolina to the British. But whites were still prohibited from selling anywhere past Fort 96, Davidson's Fort in North Carolina, and Fort Chiswell in Virginia. So again, this didn't stop the Americans from breaking that law. They were at Sycamore Shoals years later in 1776, and Dragon Canoe warned them there, stop doing this. This is going to be blood to pay. Now, a lot of things people don't know about this area, and there's a wonderful book by a lady named Anne Swan, who lives in Marion. She self-published this book, and it's called The Other Side of the River. And she tells the story beautifully of basically the forts or small outposts that were in McDowell, Burke, and Caldwell County. And there were a lot of them. I mean, it was amazing when you look at the numbers and the stories she's got in there. There was a lot of small outposts there. And these outposts, some of them were just small block houses, some of them were full-scale forts, but they were just under attack almost daily. And it was dangerous for anybody to go out and hunt, cut wood. And it had gotten so bad that by 1776, the governors of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia authorized this expedition led by Rutherford. And the plan was they wanted to destroy the Cherokee, which basically the homeland, even though the Cherokee had villages in other areas, the focus of their community was in Western North Carolina. So they had 3 divisions of this militia unit. There was a North Carolina contingent that was led by Rutherford. There was a South Carolina division led by Major Andrew Williamson, and there was a Virginia unit led by Colonel William Christensen. Now these 3 units were going to converge into one, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But Rutherford was the overall commander of this army, which when they finally all came together, totaled over 4,000 men, which again is an interesting benchmark in American history. That was the largest militia campaign ever in American history. Nobody talks about that, but it's true. Their plan was pretty simple. The Virginia militia would march south and would attack the Overhill Cherokee villages. A very small group of Georgians would supplement Rutherford's North Carolina army and would march north and attack the towns in North Carolina. Rutherford would march from the Piedmont, while the South Carolina militia under Major Williamson would march north and rendezvous with Rutherford. They would all kind of come together in Western North Carolina. Now, the militia had no idea whatsoever what they would face. They were scared because they had seen some of them had actually fought at Cowley Pass and had seen the disaster that had been, and so they didn't want this same thing to happen. But they were ready for that because they were more prepared. They didn't have the British holding them back. They were actually could fight on their own and fight the way the Indians did, tree to tree, guerrilla style. Now, but the primary objective here for the Rutherford campaign was not just, they wanted to kill Indians, yes, but they knew that coming in, when they were coming, by the time they got there, as long as they were going to be there, they wanted to destroy every farm, every home, every crop grown, all the storage of the crops by the Cherokee. They wanted the Cherokee to have nothing but the clothes on their backs with no food or shelter when winter hit. And they knew that by doing that, that would decimate the tribe. Rutherford began recruiting in Salisbury on July 1st, 1776. In just a few days, he had signed up 2,500 men. He spent the rest of July outfitting them, and on August 1st, they left Salisbury, as did divisions from the other states. There were two more rally points for North Carolina troops, both of them nearby here. Cathy's Fort, which is east of present-day 221 and Hankins Road. The original fort was on the hill on the north side of the Catawba River. The other rally point was Davidson's Fort near present-day Old Fort, and there's a reconstructed version of that fort there today. Rutherford's men, now close to 2,600, camped in Pleasant Gardens, North Carolina, which is just right over the road here, in late August. And then they headed west on the morning of September 1st. So again, this plan's come together because it's getting fall now. Summer's kind of coming to an end. So they want to get there and they want to destroy all this so the Cherokees will suffer and starve in the winter. Williamson's South Carolina contingent left the same day, and he left 300 of his men to reinforce the fort at Seneca, South Carolina, and he took another 2,000 to meet Rutherford. On 17, and this is real interesting, and we're going to, by the way, on September 19th, the South Carolina militia was ambushed by 300 Cherokee and 50 Loyalists in present-day Macon County, North Carolina. This was a steep gorge that was known, different reports, some people call it the Black Hole, some people call it the Black Gorge. But a friend of mine actually owns that battlefield now. It's just an old pasture in the area there. And we're going to have a event there in September this year commemorating that event with some Cherokee dancers and Cherokee programs and a militia camp and some things there. So that's just a side note for that. But on September 19th, these guys were ambushed. The South Carolina men were fortunate in that they had 100 Catawba Indian scouts with them. They were led by Captain Sam Boykin. And to differentiate, so they would know the difference between the Cherokee and the Catawba, the Catawba Rangers wore buck tails, deer tails in their hair to show the difference between them and the Cherokee. This battle was a really fierce battle that involved hand-to-hand combat. It was really the only real battle of the campaign. It lasted 2 hours. The Patriot force had 12 militia and 1 Indian scout killed, and 24 militia and 2 Indian scouts killed. It was, and I say 2 different types of militia. There were 2 different types of militia there. There was the Indian militia and there was the Patriot militia. There were several famous leaders on both sides in this battle. One of the leaders on the Patriot side was Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens. They were the 2 most prominent ones. And of course, on the Cherokee side, there was Oconostota, Ostanaco, and Dragon Canoe. And let's again kind of veer off here a second to take a little look at these guys, because these are really interesting men. Thomas Sumter was born in 1734, and he fought at Braddock's defeat, and he became a famous frontier Indian fighter. He was nicknamed the Fighting Gamecock, and that's the reason the University of South Carolina Gamecocks have their name today. It came from his nickname. You've heard of Lieutenant Henry Timberlake's expedition amongst the Cherokee in 1761. Sumter was his guide for Timberlake. Sumter later took Cherokee chiefs, including Ostenaco, to Williamsburg in 1762, where Thomas Jefferson heard the Cherokee chief speak and described him as the greatest orator I've ever heard speak. Sumter, though, he was a little bit of a rascal too. He was imprisoned as a debtor in 1766 in Virginia, and his buddy Joseph Martin broke him out of prison by paying the guards some money and a tomahawk. But he later moved to upstate South Carolina, where he became a very prominent landowner and slaveholder and became very rich. As I said, he fought at the Black Hole Battle, but was sent back to South Carolina before the campaign went further. So he didn't go any further on the Rutherford campaign than there. But he fought all over the South during the Revolutionary War and died in 1832 at age 97. He was the last surviving general of the Revolutionary War. Andrew Pickens was known as the Wizard Owl by the Cherokee. If you ever have seen a painting of Pickens, you'd see why they called him that, because he looked like a big old giant bird. He had a big, huge nose, beak, and he was not a real handsome man, but he was a tough fighter. He was born in Pennsylvania in 1739. He moved to Virginia as a child and to South Carolina in the early 1760s. And like Sumter, he became a rich plantation owner, owning a plantation known as Hopewell. It was near Seneca, South Carolina, and he fought all over the state during the Revolutionary War, including the Battle of Cowpens, Augusta, the Siege of 96, Battle of Eutaw Springs. He was a big right-hand man of Francis Marion the Swamp Fox, and both of them had served in the Grant and Griffin campaigns in 1761 with the British fighting the Cherokee. Now, again, I mentioned them briefly earlier. Ostenaco, Dragon Canoe, and Oconostado are arguably the finest war chiefs in tribal history. As I said, Ostenaco was a famous orator and diplomat. He had actually traveled to London in 1762. And Oconostado was known as the great warrior of Chota. He hated white men, period. He had seen so much of them done wrong. He didn't like the French. He didn't like the English. He liked the French a little bit better just because they didn't seem to want to live there. They just wanted to trade. But he didn't trust either one of them. As I said, he had had taken Fort Loudon. He had defeated Montgomery's troops at Cowley Pass, leading entirely Cherokee warriors. He was a big, muscular man. He had a scarred face from smallpox, which, again, another reason he hated the British. And he left speech making to the others. He made one real simple statement. He said, "I fear no man or nation, including King George and all of his forces." And he was just absolutely fearless guy. He was a great strategist. A lot of the Indians just fought kind of willy-nilly, however they wanted to. He planned battles, campaigns. Dragon Canoe, the youngest of the war chiefs, was similar to Oconostado in size and strength and fierce tenacity. He would be a fierce enemy of all white men the rest of his life. He, even later after the Revolutionary War ended, he formed his own group of Indians called the Chickamauga Cherokees, and they had Shawnee, Creek, a lot of different ones, and they settled near Chattanooga, and he fought the white men to his death in 1792. But so Rutherford, going against these people, had his work cut out for him. So now on September 1st, 1776, with close to 3,000 men, they've left McDowell County and they're heading west. Now basically the route they were following was essentially what I-40 is today. They were taking I-40, but it was a path where I-40 is that would go to Old Fort. They would cross the gap into present-day Black Mountain. They would take a left there and follow the Pigeon River into present-day Canton, and then following the old trail over the Pigeon Gap, the same one that my great-great-uncle Henry followed when he came to Haywood County. Came into present-day Waynesville, and then, if you can relate to modern-day route, they got on what's now the 4-lane Great Smoky Mountain Expressway heading west toward Dillsboro and Sylva. Of course, none of those places were there then. This was just still a trail. So when they got to about where Dillsboro, North Carolina is today, they took a left again, headed directly to the Cherokee villages near present-day Franklin. That was a huge, huge Cherokee village there. And that was where they intended to rendezvous with Williamson's South Carolina militia. So they had 2,000 from South Carolina coming there, meeting his almost 3,000 men here. They connected at Hiawassee Village on September 26, 1776. And he had, by that time, close to 5,000 men under his command, including 1,400 drovers and pack horses, again making them the largest militia unit by far ever in American history. You have to understand how devastating this attack was on the Cherokee. People don't understand, a lot of people don't understand, maybe you folks do. The Cherokee, contrary to a lot of popular opinion, they didn't live in teepees. They lived in log cabins. They had council houses. They grew corn. A lot of the things that the white frontiersmen had learned, they had learned from the Cherokee. So they were leading, they had big council houses. Women were highly respected. They were leaders, they were matriarchs, and they were allowed to speak and had a voice. The women were huge, equal to men in every way in that regard. So to come in and destroy this, to burn this whole place to the ground, to burn their council houses down, to burn their basically places where they were corn cribs, that sort of thing, and their actual fields, they couldn't have dropped a bomb on them and hurt them any worse. I mean, it was really, really terrible. So they immediately destroyed several of the lower, middle, and overhill towns. Then they headed northwest into what's now Swain County. And again, if in modern terms, there's a Route 28 that runs between Franklin and Bryson City, goes through the Needmore tract, follows the Little Tennessee River. That would be the route they were taking at that time. They then turned east, heading back this way once they got into what is now Bryson City, and they started targeting the valley towns. Now this is of huge significance here too. If you've ever been between Cherokee and Bryson City, there's a big Cherokee site there called Katua, and that is the sacred motherland of the Cherokee, the mother village. The Cherokee believe that's where they originated. They believe that it's a real long origin story, but a turtle came out of the river with a man on his back, and the Cherokee, a man and woman on his back, and the Cherokee originated there. So this town was there. It would be like Mecca or Jerusalem for a Muslim or a Jew. It was that sacred to the tribe. So this town was destroyed. Meanwhile, there was a separate quick strike of cavalry. Rutherford was smart. He had deployed these quick strike forces of around close to 100 cavalrymen to go make quick strikes on some of the smaller villages. So that resulted in 5 more villages being destroyed. By early October, now it's getting cold, they had destroyed over 35 towns and villages. I mean, completely burned them to the ground, crops, houses, storage bins, everything. And most of the militia headed back home safely, following that same route back to Davidson's Fort. They only lost 5 men, and one of them was wounded by friendly fire. Their own men shot him. One of the things I never have quite understood, maybe it was because of the large numbers, but there was almost no resistance. Other than the Battle of the Black Hole, with all these great warriors, at no point did they try to band together and ambush them or do any sort of thing like they'd done before. The Cherokee losses, as far as battle losses, weren't heavy. They lost about 60 men. There were 12 hostages. Those numbers were probably higher than that because the Cherokee really believed in never leaving anybody on the field. They didn't want anybody desecrated, so they made sure that they would remove dead and wounded from the battlefield. But Rutherford wasn't done. He launched another cavalry campaign in early October with 100 horsemen under his command, and they continued making these quick strike attacks until October 16th, when 100 of Rutherford's special cavalry were attacked by Ostenaco and Oconostota. So this was a very, very fierce battle, which again, now these guys are finally, they've had enough, they're starting to fight back a little bit. But neither side really suffered any major losses. They attacked the tribe again and fought with the same two warriors, Ostenaco and Oconostota, on November 16th with minimal losses again on both sides. The Cherokee withdrew to regroup for the winter. Now, there's a lot of questions you can ask, again, why didn't they regroup? And there was still a significant amount of Cherokee in the area. There may not have been 4,000 or 5,000, but it was probably close to that if they could got them all together. But they'd been scattered. And now with winter coming on, they had to find a way to survive the winter. They had to go find a cave to live in, or build a hut to live in, or scrape together, go out and kill some deer, or whatever they could do, because they didn't have any corn, they didn't have any of the vegetables they usually had, they dried or stored for the winter. So I got to believe that's probably, it was at that point it was survival. They had a choice to make. Our women and children are going to die and freeze to death, or we can fight. So it was not a hard decision to make, I would think, and I'm sure that's what their thinking was. But anyway, by that time there would be this Cherokee was. There would be battles and raids and skirmishes the rest of the Revolutionary War, but until the 1790s, even after the Revolutionary War. But basically, Rutherford's campaign pretty much stopped it. It pretty much opened up the frontier and made it a lot safer. It also allowed the Americans to focus on fighting the British, too. So, like I said, the Cherokee were just trying to survive, and in 1777 was actually the worst winter in North Carolina history, records show. So it couldn't have come at a worse time. Dragon Canoe and his Chickamauga Cherokees moved into the Chattanooga area and would terrorize, along with the Shawnee, would terrorize frontier settlements along the frontier until 1793 when Dragon Canoe died. They were a rough bunch too. There was a guy named Bob Binge. He was half Cherokee, half white, had red hair. He could infiltrate white people and kill them. And he and Dragon Canoe were big friends. There was an Indian called Doublehead who was just a psychopathic killer who convinced Binge that if they would eat the hearts of white men, that would gain their strength. So they would kill men, eat their hearts and livers. And George Washington met Doublehead at a treaty signing and asked Doublehead, was it true he had eaten white flesh? And he said, yeah. And he said, what did it taste like? He said, well, I found it very salty. He said, I prefer deer meat much, much more. But as I said, they would continue to raid until the 1790s. Griffin Rutherford would, hard to say those two words together for me, would go on to serve valiantly for the Patriots' cause in the Revolutionary War. He led several more militia campaigns against renegade Indians during that time whenever they would flare up again. But again, nothing serious, nothing major. He later fought at the Battle of Ramseur's Mill down in what's now Lincoln County near Lincolnton. There's a big event coming up for that, commemorating that soon. He fought at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina, where he was wounded and captured by the Brits. Now, it's interesting that we talk about Camden, and we won't get into this today because it's too lengthy to get into, but that's where the Kings Mountain and Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse come in, because by the time Camden fell, the South had fallen. British controlled Wilmington, they controlled Charleston, they controlled Camden, and that's when the frontiersmen took over and saved the Revolutionary War, which is a separate program for another day. But Rutherford was captured at Camden. He was wounded. He was later released in a prisoner of war exchange in 1781, and he led several more campaigns against his old adversary, dragon canoe from 1781 until the 1790s, but again, this took place in Tennessee. 1790s, Griffin Rutherford became a politician. He ran for governor, failed to win. He later moved to Sumter, South Carolina, where he prospered until his death in 1805 at the age of 84. He is one of those characters I really enjoy studying and learning about because he was like so many of us. He wasn't a perfect person. He was flawed in many ways. He had been just really an outlaw in many ways in terms of what he had done before the Revolutionary War. But his service in the Revolutionary War, especially the 1776 campaign named after him, played a huge but little known role in winning the war. Most historians will readily agree that had the campaign not happened, the Cherokee and Shawnee continued to control the frontier with the British allies, the outcome of the war could easily have been different, and the Brits could have won, because there's no way the Patriots could have fought battles on two fronts. They couldn't have fought a major Indian campaign funded by the British, nor could they have fought the British themselves. And of course, as I said, by doing this set the table, so to speak, for Kings Mountain, Cowpens, and Guilford Courthouse. And that, again, I just can't stress strongly enough, and if you haven't been to that program I do, please come back to it again sometime, or just go do your own research, because those three battles changed America. There's a very good chance America would have lost the Revolutionary War had it not been for those three battles. And that's something that people just don't talk about. So that's a program for another day, though. So I thank you all for coming today. I will open up the floor for any questions. If you'd like to purchase any books, be glad to do that for you. And got business cards up there where you can look on my website, look at the events, different programs we've got coming up. I've got a lot. I'll be back here again in April, I believe 17th, 16th. And I think we were talking about the Grant and Griffin campsite. So we talked a little bit about that today. We'll talk about that in detail. And I love talking about that because you talk about some interesting characters. They really were. That was really Indians fighting Indians with Americans and British on both sides. I mean, it was wild.
Name that battle again, please.
Which one?
His name.
The 1761 and 60 Grant and Griffin campaigns, they took place during the French and Indian War. And the first one took place at Cowie Pass near Franklin, North Carolina, and it was a massacre. The reason it was a massacre was because they didn't have any Indians and very few militiamen fighting for them. They went there and fought the Cherokee just like they would have fought the French in Europe. And the Cherokee just wiped them out just about. Only thing that saved them was Francis Marion was there, and he had a militia, led a counterattack, and allowed them to retreat. They came back a year later, learning from the Grant campaign. Came back the next year, and that year they came back bringing Indians with them. They had Catawba Indians, they had Mohawk Indians, they had Stockbridge Mohicans, which were really interesting people, which we'll talk about next month. And they had a small contingent of Rogers Rangers, and they had a whole contingent of American militiamen. So these guys weren't going to let them make the same mistake twice. And to Grant's credit, even though he hated Americans, he knew that he knew these guys could shoot, and he knew these guys could fight, so he wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. So they went back, and basically the second battle, he was not ambushed. They weren't ambushed at Cowie Pass, but they went into Cherokee country and destroyed Cherokee country. So it took place. There wasn't any one specific battle in that particular one, excuse me, but there were just a bunch of them. No. Cowie Pass, excuse me, is over near Franklin. The Cowie Tunnel is near Dillsboro, right beside the Tuckasegee River. And of course, my Smoky Mountain Railways book, that's the site of sad tragedies of building the Murphy Branch. The Murphy Branch was a 128-mile stretch of railroad that went from Old Fort to Murphy, North Carolina. It was built entirely by convict labor. It took 20 years to build 128 miles of railroad. It took 4 years to build the entire transcontinental railroad. And it was just brutal. But at Cowie Tunnel, 20 prisoners were drowned there. And when their boat overturned, when they were crossing the river to work on the tunnel, and they were just buried in unnamed graves there, as so many thousands of them were during that terrible time. But that building that railroad, as terrible as it was, completely changed Western North Carolina, because up until that time, Western North Carolina in 1870 wasn't any different than North Carolina in 1770, really. So it was really changed everything because there were no railroads in the state at that time. But that's, again, another story, another program. Any other questions?
The black hole incident you talked about.
Yes, sir.
Have you ever had an opportunity to explore that area, or?
I have a little bit. We know the battle took place possibly there, but we don't know. There's some debate depending on who you talk to, and there's not enough records, official records, where you can say, but we feel like Joe Sam Queen owns the property. And we feel like if it didn't take place there, it's within half a mile of there. We've never been able, we hadn't done a lot of looking, to be honest with you. We want to do that at some point. There's got to be some artifacts there, surely, especially if you can find the actual, for sure, side of the battlefield. But it's got to be right there because it's real distinctive, like the name implies. It's kind of a gorge. And so you've got a clear area there, but it drops off really quick. It was a perfect ambush place. And it was a fierce, it was hand-to-hand fighting going on there. And again, that's something that, I never heard anything about that, until just a few years ago. So, but there's always, like I say, there's always, something to learn. I went back, I mentioned the slaves. There were 5 black men at Kings Mountain. Their names were Primus, just one name. He was a freedman. There was a guy named Andrew Ferguson, a guy named Esaias Bowman, a guy named Ishmael Titus. And then John Brody was William Campbell's slave who just held the horses. He didn't fight, but we've later found out that he was probably Campbell's half-brother. So he was from the West Indies. So there's always, when I did the last time I did the Battle on Kings Mountain, I didn't know that. There's great stories here in Caldwell County about a guy who fought and was captured at Kings Mountain, whose family later settled here and had one of Colonel Ferguson's whistles, battle whistles. So yeah, so it's there's just so much history, and unfortunately, and because it really was a civil war, there was a lot of hard feelings for years after that. There was a guy here in Caldwell County, Cindy may remember his name, I can't remember it now, but it was a father and son, and the father had fought for the British, the son had fought for the Americans, and they never spoke again the rest of their lives. So it was a brutal time. Yes, sir.
Do you think that Rutherford's focus on Cherokee during those years is a way to reconcile his earlier leanings toward the British, because he could focus on fighting natives rather than fighting British? And what do you think? Do you think there was like any single significant event that kind of changed his loyalties?
That's a good question, and it would be entirely speculation on my part, of course. I think I can answer it in 2 ways. First of all, I would like to think that there was some noble type of feeling that he was like, I screwed up before, I want to make it right. But I also know that being the kind of guy he was going to look at what was best for him. And so I think there was a whole lot of that going on at that point in time too, where he was kind of going, which way should I go here? Would it be more financially beneficial for me to do this? And then, of course, also being a big landholder, there was also the real threat of getting killed by Indians. So, some of it was just, you had to do it. You know, you couldn't, there wasn't like an option where you could just go, well, we're not going to worry about it. You know, so, and at that point in time, the war had started. So, you know, you either had to say you're going to fight for the Cherokee and the British, or you're going to have to fight against the British. So, you know, I like to think that, like all of us, we've all made mistakes when we were younger. We've all done things we regret. We've all done things that we wish we had done differently. And maybe, you know, as he got older and saw some of those things, and maybe it started, but he sure didn't mind taking money off those guys and making money with them when it benefited him. And he didn't mind shooting and hanging his own people when it benefited him. So, you know, there's that side too. So, you know, but I mean, again, that was, you know, 10, 12 years before the Rutherford campaign, so 10 years, I guess. So, you know, a lot of things can change in 10 years. And of course, at that point in time, you know, you had to make, I mean, these, you know, I've often, well, it's like Kings Mountain, for example. I think, I'm not sure Kings Mountain would have happened the way it did were it not for the message sent by the British to the mountain men in Tennessee. Mountain men in Tennessee, they just want to be left alone. You know, they just wanted to live their lives. They had their hands full over there fighting Indians and surviving. What was going on the coastal plain of North Carolina, you know, technically they were under their jurisdiction, but they got no benefit from them. So, but then all of a sudden you get this post saying, I tell you what, you're going to come over here and you're going to go with us, we're going to come and kill you. Well, we ain't playing that, you know. So, so that changed. And I think there still would have been a Kings Mountain, but I'm just not sure it would have been, some of those guys would have been involved in it. But the other thing about Kings Mountain, and I don't want to get too much in this now because I've talked too long already, but we talk about this in the Kings Mountain program. You know, you hear all the stories, the Over Mountain Victory Trail, the Over Mountain Victory Trail organization and the men, all legitimate, all true, all great. But of the 11 Patriot commanders at Kings Mountain, 8 of them were from North Carolina. And I mean this part of North Carolina, Wilkes County, Burke County, Caldwell County, Lincoln County. Only 3 of them were from Tennessee. Now they get the most credit, you know, Sevier, Isaac Shelby, and they were obviously great soldiers. But that's one thing I like to talk about in the Kings Mountain program is that and another thing about the Kings Mountain program, which goes back to my first point, which kind of goes along with the Rutherford question. After Kings Mountain, more than half those guys just went back home. They didn't fight anymore. They went on back to Tennessee or wherever. But most of the ones that were here in North Carolina, they went on and fought at Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse. Some of them went home, some of them didn't. And but I mean, after, again, to show you the animosity that was among these people, after they had killed all these people, most of the prisoners at Kings Mountain were hung. There were only a few were sent to prisoner war camps, and the ones that weren't hung, like I said, were sent to prisoner war camps, but as they were going back to their homes or going to cow pens, they were just stopping and hanging people along the road every night. And one of the patriots in that group said that that was the finest fruit God had ever put on a tree, was those hanging traitors. And he said he wished that God had made more of those trees. So I mean, these guys, and it was both sides. I mean, because these same guys had seen, you know, they'd been maybe on a hunting trip or whatnot, and their wives were abused, or houses were, you know, burned, or families were tarred and feathered. So these guys, it was a true civil war in the truest sense of the word. So it was, but yeah, it was, but you know, it was interesting because most of the Tennessee contingent, after they fought at Kings Mountain, felt like, hey, our job's done, we're going back home. Daniel Morgan went to, which is a super interesting character we talk about in the other program. You know, he led the troops at Cowpens and took them on to Guilford Courthouse too. And he was just a brilliant officer. I mean, some of the strategy he used was just great, you know, and funny, great. He had been whipped. He had been a teamster during the French and Indian War, and had slapped a British officer, insulted him. He knocked the British officer out, and he was punished ordered to take 500 lashes with a bullwhip. Well, 100 would kill you. And so that the guy was basically saying, you're going to die. And he gave him 500 lashes, and he told him about halfway through it, Morgan wouldn't scream, holler, anything. He just grit his teeth. And the officer told him, he said, if you'll ask for mercy and scream, I'll stop. And he goes, keep on. And he beat him more, and he stopped. And Morgan said, nope, that's $4.99. You owe me one more. And he took the whole 500. So I mean, this guy, and he was a big, big man. I mean, for that era, there wasn't me, and then Benjamin Cleveland was at Kings Mountain too. He was another interesting guy from Wilkes County. He weighed over 300 pounds. But yeah, so don't get started on that. I'll be here the rest of the day talking about that. Any other questions?
Are you familiar with the twin populace?
I am, yes, sir.
Okay, and the Cherokee and the Catawbas, the way I heard it was the Catawbas were trading with the white people, and the Cherokees told them they was trading with them so much it's beginning to look like them, and that was fighting the war.
Yeah.
The way I've heard it.
That's the story I've heard too, and they were fierce enemies. The Cherokee, the Catawba had a chief by the name of King Hagler. That was his name. And there's actual paintings of him, and he was a really, really renowned warrior. And he fought on the Grant and Griffin campaigns. And he took a contingent of, it's just, for me to think about some of this stuff, it fascinates me because on this Grant campaign in particular, they're picking up Indians every night as they're going west and from South Carolina. So they started out with Stockbridge Mohicans. They started out with 10 Mohawks who came down from New York just because they wanted to fight anybody. They didn't care. And they had King Hagler's guys. And then during the night, every night as they camped, there would be another Creeks coming in or different enemies of the Cherokee coming in. And they said that the war dances and this was in American camps, the war dances would be so loud and drums would be so loud that it would drown out the wolves that were howling out around the camps because the wolves were there trying to get some food. So, you think about, and the British regular soldiers, there were a lot of regular soldiers on this campaign too, and the regular British soldiers were amazed. They had never seen alligators before. And then on the coastal plain, they were seeing stuff. There was earthquakes, there was alligators, there were just all sorts of things that were just, crazy to them. But they were fierce enemies, Catawba and Cherokee, and I've heard that twin poplar story before. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. They lived down near what's around Waxhaw. That was around in South Carolina line, that area right there. That's where their kind of primary villages were. But they had always been British allies. They fought with the British during the French and Indian War. They fought with the British. But they had gotten really, they weren't a big tribe to start with, and they had lost a lot of people during the wars and they had lost some to disease. So they weren't as big a factor in the Revolutionary War as they were in the French and Indian War. Any other questions? Well, thank y'all so much for coming. I really appreciate it and always enjoy it.